Oh, what a sight to behold.
Truly a miracle.
They say some kings are born to rule, others are born to haunt. And Edward the Confessor, Saint Edward, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, seems to have done both. 1,000 years have passed, but his coffin still lies at the very heart of Westminster Abbey, sealed inside a marble shrine, hidden behind velvet ropes, off limits to the public. It should have been his final resting place, the end of a quiet reign marked by piety, patience, and political ambiguity. But history did not allow him peace. His coffin has been opened not once, not twice, but at least 5 separate times. Monarchs, monks, thieves, and even soldiers have broken into his grave. Some came searching for blessings. Others came for relics. Some came in reverence. Others came for gold. But every time, they disturbed something older, colder, and more persistent than bones. They disturbed the silence that a dead king tried to keep. Edward ruled in the years before the Norman conquest, a time when England was fragmented between warlords, when crowns were passed through bloodshed as often as through birthright. He was not a warrior, not a conqueror, not a man who craved power in the traditional sense. Born the son of Ethelred, the Unready, and Queen Emma, raised in exile in Normandy, Edward spent more years praying than plotting. When he finally took the throne in the year 1042, it was almost by default. Every other contender had either died or been killed. And yet, despite his reputation for holiness, Edward left behind a curse, not by intention, but by omission. He died in the year 1066 without naming a clear successor. Whispers said he had promised the throne to Harold Godwinson. Others swore he had promised it to William, Duke of Normandy. Still others believed the Viking claimant, Harold Hardrada, had been offered a chance. 3 men, 3 armies, and 1 empty throne. Within months of Edward's death, England was at war. Within the year, the Saxon dynasty was gone, and William the Conqueror stood victorious on the battlefield at Hastings. The Confessor's silence had ended 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon rule. But this is not a story about a throne. It is a story about a coffin. When Edward died, he was buried beneath the high altar of the church. He himself had built Westminster Abbey. It was the most sacred space in all of England, and his tomb was constructed with reverence and care. For a while, it remained untouched. But by the time of King Henry I, only a few decades later, it had already become a place of fascination. Henry ordered the tomb opened. No one knows exactly what he saw, but the real obsession began nearly a century after Edward's death, when Pope Alexander III canonized him in the year 1162. The next year, in 1163, King Henry II personally oversaw the opening of Edward's coffin to move his body to a more elaborate shrine. And that was when the first miracle, or the first myth, was recorded. They said the king's body had not decayed, that his skin was supple, his face lifelike, and his robes still fresh, that he looked as though he had only just fallen asleep. Perhaps that's why they started calling him a saint. Perhaps that's why they never stopped coming back. In the year 1271, the coffin was opened again, this time to insert the heart of another man, a young royal named Henry of Almaine, grandson of King John. His father had demanded that the boy's heart rest beside the saint, believing that proximity to Edward would offer eternal grace. A strange gesture. A strange désécration. But stranger things were still to come. By the time King Henry VIII arrived in the 16th century, the country had changed. The monasteries were under attack, Shrines were being destroyed, and even Edward the Confessor, saint or not, was not safe. Henry's agents dismantled the shrine, removed the body, and allegedly disturbed the remains yet again. Gold and jewels were stripped. Stones were stolen. Bones may have been moved. It would not be the last time. The most detailed desecration came in the year 1685. 300 years had passed since Edward's canonization, and the world had changed beyond recognition. But curiosity remained. A hole had already formed in the lid of his coffin, caused by time and carelessness. Through it, one man, Charles Taylor, lowered his hand into the grave. He claimed to have lifted the skull, shifted bones aside, and pulled from beneath them a crucifix enameled in gold and a chain 24 inches long. He showed them to the king, and then the lid was removed entirely. Witnesses reported a skull still intact, jaw complete, crowned by a faint golden circlet. They found linen, silk flowers, dust, and bone, all that remained of a man once believed incorruptible. It was then that they finally decided to seal the coffin for good. An iron case was built. It was clamped shut. And during the First World War, in the year 1916, the wooden superstructure of the shrine was quietly removed to protect it from bombings. But they did not open the coffin again. Not since 1685. Not after what they saw. Today, Edward the Confessor's shrine is closed to the public. Visitors can only glimpse it on special guided tours. It stands behind the high altar of Westminster Abbey, where 5 kings and 4 queens also lie. But only Edward lies within a coffin that was opened by popes, plundered by kings, violated by thieves, and worshipped by pilgrims. His story is one of holiness and horror, and his silence, his failure to name a successor, his refusal to claim absolute power, set fire to a kingdom that still bears the scars. And the coffin, it still rests there, heavy, quiet, shut, but not forgotten, because some kings die once, and others refuse to stay buried. He was born to save a dynasty, and yet his birth marked the beginning of its end. Edward, the long-awaited son of King Henry VIII and Queen Jane Seymour, arrived in the autumn of the year 1537 to the sound of cannons, Issoir, and the collective exhale of a nation that believed its future had finally arrived. England had been waiting for him for decades. 6 wives, endless scandals, and rivers of blood had all been spent in pursuit of this single fragile child, the boy who would secure the Tudor name forever. They called him the Miracle Prince, the child of prophecy, the answer to a king's desperate prayers. But from the very first day, the shadow of death followed him like a second crown. His mother, Jane Seymour, died less than 2 weeks after giving birth, consumed by fever and infection. Henry ordered mourning gowns for her, even as he celebrated the birth of his son. It was the first exchange of life for legacy, a transaction that would repeat itself until the Tudors were no more. Edward was not raised as other boys were. He grew up in a palace of silence, surrounded by tutors, clerics, and guards who spoke to him with reverence and fear. He was taught Latin before he learned kindness, theology before laughter, and the burden of kingship before the comfort of affection. They said he was a brilliant student, a boy who could quote scripture by the age of 6, who wrote essays on faith before most children learned to write their names. But intelligence was not what he needed. He needed strength. He needed time, and neither would be given to him. His father, bloated with age and triumph, it saw in him not a child, but a promise. And that promise was kept under lock and key. Every meal was tested for poison. Every playmate was vetted for lineage. Every word he spoke was recorded, as though it might someday be prophecy. When Henry VIII died in the winter of 1547, his body swollen, and his soul already condemned by half the kingdom. Edward was 9 years old. They dressed him in robes too heavy for his thin frame, placed a crown too large upon his head, and proclaimed him King of England, Ireland, and France. The people cheered because they had to doubling, not because they believed a child could rule a land torn apart by his father's wars and divorces. Behind the grandeur of the coronation, the court whispered the truth that the real power lay not with the boy, but with those who surrounded him. His uncle, Edward Seymour, became Lord Protector, wielding the authority of a monarch in everything but name. And under his shadow, the young king was reduced to an emblem of Protestant triumph. His father had broken with Rome for love. His son would inherit that break as a burden. At first, the boy seemed healthy enough. Though pale and thin, he spent his days between studies and sermons, rarely allowed outside, except to walk in the gardens of Hampton Court, where he memorized the Latin names of herbs and birds, perhaps hoping to understand a world that no one ever let him touch. The council praised his discipline, calling him a second Solomon, a young Josiah destined to purify the realm of sin. But beneath the flattery was fear of what would happen if the boy died, and fear of what would happen if he lived long enough to think for himself. He was both king and hostage, a body belonging to the crown rather than to his own soul. By the time he reached his 13th year, the first signs of sickness had already begun. A cough that clung to his chest through the winter, fevers that left him trembling in bed, nosebleeds that would not stop. The royal physicians prescribed powders of crushed pearl, baths of wine and herbs, and endless prayers. But nothing steadied the decline. They called it the sweating sickness, then the flux, then a wasting disease. In truth, no one knew. The Tudor court, for all its pomp, had no cure for the rot that began from within. Edward grew weaker, his appetite fading, his once bright eyes dulling with pain. Still, he insisted on working, signing documents with a hand that trembled so violently. His tutors guided the quill for him. The people of London did not know the truth. They were told their king was well, that the pallor of his face was only due to study, that the heir of Henry VIII was as strong as his father and as wise as Solomon. Portraits were commissioned to prove it. Edward in ermine robes, holding the orb and scepter with the solemn poise of a ruler. But the paint lied. Behind those painted eyes was a boy who could barely climb the stairs without gasping for air, whose ribs pressed against his silk shirts, whose voice broke whenever he tried to speak at length. By the year 1550, his illness could no longer be hidden. His doctors began keeping nightly vigils. Rumors spread through the court: poison, measles, divine punishment. Some whispered that his uncle, the Lord Protector, had used him as a puppet for too long, and God was reclaiming what man had corrupted. Others said that the ghost of Anne Boleyn had cursed Henry's line, that no child of that house would ever die in peace. But superstition did not change the truth. Edward was fading. He coughed blood into linen, and the servants burned the cloth, so no one could count how much was lost. His hair thinned, his skin turned gray, and still he tried to pray, whispering verses from the Psalms as though each one might hold back the end. There were moments of recovery, false dawns that fooled even the physicians. On clear days he was carried into the gardens at Greenwich, the air filled with the scent of roses and damp soil. His frail frame wrapped in furs, though the sun was warm, he looked around and smiled. But those who stood nearby saw that his smile was not for the flowers or the sky. It was the smile of someone memorizing the world before leaving it. By that summer, he could no longer walk unaided. His legs swelled. His breathing rasped like wind through broken glass. And still, courtiers came to read him letters and treaties, as though he might live long enough to sign them. In his last months, politics replaced medicine. The question of succession haunted the palace. If Edward died, who would follow his sister Mary? The Catholic, his sister Elizabeth, the Protestant. The council feared both, and so, from his sickbed, the boy was convinced, or perhaps coerced, into rewriting the will of England itself. His cousin, Lady Jane Grey, would inherit the throne. It was a decision that would lead to blood, rebellion, and the briefest reign in English history. But Edward did not see that. His hand shook as he wrote, and when the ink dried, the future was already lost. He died on the 6th of July, 1553. As the evening bells tolled across the river, he was 15 years old. His last words, whispered through cracked lips, were a prayer, Lord. Have mercy upon me, and take my spirit. The court did not weep, they prepared. His body was embalmed in haste, wrapped in cerecloth and sealed in lead. The vault built for him at Westminster Abbey was so small that his coffin barely fit. No monument was raised, no marble effigy carved. The son of Henry VIII, the promise of a dynasty. He was lowered into the earth, like a secret meant to be forgotten. And for centuries, forgotten he was. Wars came and went. Monarchs rose and fell. And Edward's resting place was left to the dust and the darkness when it was finally opened in the 19th century. Historians found not a royal tomb but a cracked shell. The lead coffin buckled. The wrappings decayed. The bones exposed. The boy king. The miracle child. The last son of Henry VIII. Lay forgotten beneath the feet of tourists and priests who no longer remembered his face. That is how history keeps its promises, not in gold, but in silence. Edward's short life, born of desperation and ended in neglect, became the quiet hinge on which an entire dynasty turned. The Tudors would never produce another legitimate son. The line that had begun in blood at Bosworth ended in a whisper in Greenwich Palace, with a boy whose lungs filled with it, and above him, carved in stone, the family motto still lingered. Mocking the centuries, truth is the daughter of time. But time had already buried the truth, and the child who was supposed to save England had instead been swallowed by it. The funeral of King Edward VI was grand, only in appearance. A desperate performance meant to convince a weary nation that divine order still reigned. Even as its foundations crumbled, the court had no time to build him the tomb he deserved. No time to design marble effigies, or to carve his name into gold. Death had come too suddenly. And summer was too hot. The body of the boy king, wrapped hastily in cerecloth and laid within a lead coffin, began to swell with the gases of decay. The physicians urged speed. The embalmers worked by candlelight, whispering prayers as they stitched and sealed, while the council outside argued over the next monarch before the old one was even at rest. There was no love in the planning, only urgency, and perhaps shame. Shame that the heir of Henry VIII, the child for whom so much blood had been shed, had died before he ever truly ruled. When the day came, the River Thames became his final road. A black barge carried the coffin from Greenwich to Westminster, gliding through water that shimmered with the reflection of a morning sun. Crowds lined the banks in silence, hats pressed to chests, faces pale with disbelief. Some whispered prayers. Others merely watched, uncertain whether they were mourning a boy or the last fragile thread of Tudor certainty. He had been the kingdom's promise. And now that promise was drifting away beneath black velvet and royal banners that barely stirred in the wind. The oarsmen rowed slowly, their movements heavy, as if the river itself resisted the burden it now carried. At Westminster Abbey, the procession unfolded like a theater of grief. The great doors opened to a flood of incense and song, the vaulted ceiling echoing with the chants of choristers who sang of eternal life, while every eye in the room knew the truth that this life had barely begun. The coffin, small and warped even then, was placed before the high altar, surrounded by candles whose flames trembled like breath. The Archbishop of Canterbury read the rites, his voice steady but hollow, each word striking the stone walls and falling back lifeless. The air was thick with wax and sorrow. Courtiers stood in perfect ranks, their expressions trained, their hearts elsewhere. For even as they listened to scripture, they were thinking of politics of Mary, of Elizabeth, of what storm might come next. No one spoke of the boy himself, of the quiet ways he had tried to rule, of the gentle manners that had made servants weep, and tutors call him saintly. They spoke only of what he represented, the Protestant reformer, the symbol of faith renewed, the heir who had upheld the church, his father built from sin and ambition. It was easier to bury an idea than a child, easier to grieve a king than a boy who had never been allowed to live freely. So they buried the myth, the man who had never been a man, the monarch who had never reigned. The vault prepared for him lay near the tomb of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, his grandparents, founders of the Tudor line. It was a small chamber, hastily built, tucked between greater monuments like a forgotten chapter, wedged between epochs. When the coffin was lowered, the bearers struggled. The marble edges were too narrow, the space too tight. Someone whispered that it was not fitting, that a king deserved more. But no one dared delay. The coffin was forced into place, the lid of the vault sealed with stone, and with a few muttered prayers and the faint sound of a closing door, the boy was gone. Years passed. The abbey filled with new kings, new queens, new bodies wrapped in silk and stone. But Edward's resting place remained bare. No monument rose. No statue carved his likeness. No inscription beyond a few words of record. The boy who had once been hailed as England's hope was forgotten. His cousin Jane Grey was executed. His sister Mary ruled, then died. His other sister, Elizabeth, became legend. And through it all, beneath the cold marble floor, Edward lay silent, unseen, untouched. The line that had begun with Henry's fury ended with Elizabeth's solitude, and the boy who had been born to save it had been left without even a name upon his tomb. Time, indifferent and cruel, worked its quiet ruin. The abbey shifted under centuries of footsteps, its air filled with the dust of prayers and decay. When the English Civil War came in the 17th century, soldiers stormed its halls, shattering icons, breaking altars, seeking treasure in tombs. It was then, perhaps, that Edward's coffin was first disturbed. The lead casing split, the seal broken, the delicate equilibrium of air and time undone. No record was kept of it. But when historians later reopened the vault, they found the damage already done. The coffin had cracked. The cerecloth decayed, the bones within exposed to the damp air. His body once embalmed, wrapped, and sealed with royal precision, had become a ghostly ruin of itself. When they uncovered it again in the year 1868, the sight was grim. The lead had warped, the lid bent inward. The fabric that once swaddled his small frame now blackened and clinging to the bones like a memory refusing to fade. The scholars stood in silence, their lanterns trembling in their hands. Some turned away. Others took notes with faces drained of color. They had not expected to find him so visible, so close to touch. The boy who had been hidden from his own people in life now lay naked before their eyes in death. They said his skull gleamed faintly in the light, the trace of centuries of lead and moisture, giving it a dull, silvery sheen. There was talk of reburial, of repairing the coffin, of granting him at last the dignity denied him for centuries. But bureaucracy is as cold as marble, and nothing was done. They resealed the vault, replaced the stones, and left him there, in the same narrow space, still broken, still unremembered. It was not until 1966 that a simple stone was placed above him, inscribed with quiet finality, in memory of King Edward VI. Buried in this chapel, no effigy, no crown, no glory, just words, and the silence of the centuries that had already taken everything else. And so he remains there, beneath the feet of tourists and choirs, beneath the echo of bells that toll for other monarchs. Other names. They do not see him. They do not know that the smallest coffin beneath that grand abbey once held the last breath of the Tudor line. Edward's life began with triumph and ended in neglect. His body sealed and then forgotten. His story erased and then rediscovered only to be hidden again. Perhaps that is the truest reflection of kingship, that even the chosen can vanish, that crowns rust and dynasties decay, and that beneath all the gold and marble, every monarch returns to the same dust. He was the boy who carried the weight of a kingdom on ribs too thin to hold it, who prayed to a God that did not save him, who tried to be good in a world that had no use for goodness. And now, beneath centuries of stone and indifference, he lies exactly as he lived, small, quiet, and unseen. When Edward VI was lowered into that narrow vault, the Tudor dream was already breaking apart at the seams. His death didn't just leave a throne empty. It left a nation teetering between two visions of faith, identity, and power. The young king had been the last hope of Protestant certainty, a banner of reform raised high by those who believed England could be reshaped through scripture and law. But now that banner had fallen, and the wind shifted. In the shadows of his death, the court scrambled to control the future by rewriting the past, beginning with his will, Edward's dying wish, if it was truly his, had named Lady Jane Grey as his successor, a brilliant, devout girl no older than himself, a cousin trained to read Greek but not rule. Her reign lasted just 9 days. 9 days of trembling oaths, panicked councils, and prayers that went unanswered. When Mary Tudor, Edward's elder half-sister, marched into London with fire in her eyes and the people behind her, Jane was taken to the Tower. She would never leave it alive. This was the first ghost Edward left behind. Then came Mary, the Catholic Queen, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman who believed it was her divine duty to undo everything Edward and his father had built. She reversed the reforms. She restored the old faith. She lit the fires that burned hundreds of Protestants, their screams filling the very streets Edward had once walked in silence. And yet, despite all this fury, all this flame, She, too, left no heir. The Tudor line cracked again, and the court turned to the last branch on the tree, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, the second ghost of Edward's legacy, would take the throne with memories of her brother carved into her bones. She had lived in the same palaces, studied under the same scholars, watched the same advisors lie with smiling faces. She remembered his pale face, his trembling hands, his quiet dignity as he faded, and perhaps, in her most private moments, she remembered what it cost to wear a crown too young. She would never marry. She would never name an heir. She would outlive them all, and she would never again let a child be crowned too soon. But she did not speak of him. Hardly anyone did. Edward vanished from public memory, faster than any monarch in Tudor history. No great portrait hung in the royal halls. No holiday was declared in his name. He was mentioned in textbooks. Yes, but only in passing a transitional king, a footnote between Henry's thunder and Elizabeth's golden age. And yet, he had ruled, however briefly, however painfully. The vault where his body lay remained closed for centuries, untouched, undisturbed until historians in the 19th century, fueled by curiosity and a strange reverence for the forgotten, decided to find him. They opened the tomb with care, but what they found shook them. The lid had buckled, likely from the gases of decomposition and the weight of time. The cerecloth, meant to preserve him, had rotted into strips. His skull was exposed. His bones, naked in the silence of the chamber. No monarch should be seen like this. No child should be left like that. They recorded everything. The dimensions of the vault, the condition of the coffin, the position of the remains. They closed the tomb again quietly, quickly, and for nearly 100 more years. Nothing was done until 1966, when at last, someone decided that a king deserved at least a name above his grave. A simple plaque was placed in the floor of the chapel, in memory of King Edward VI, buried in this chapel. No flourish, no tribute, just a line and stone. But even that is more than most children are given, because that's what Edward was: a child, a boy who prayed more than he laughed, who was taught to carry the weight of England before he could carry his own sword. A boy raised to believe that he would save a kingdom and then sacrifice to the very idea of it. He was groomed to be a symbol, not a soul. In life, he was worshipped. In death, forgotten. And yet the echo of his brief reign lingers like a breath caught in the walls of Westminster wine. If you listen closely, you can still hear him, not in speeches or sermons, but in the silences of history, the missing monument, the sealed tomb, the half-finished dreams of a boy who never got the chance to grow up. And perhaps that's why his story matters. Not because he ruled long or changed everything, but because he shows us how power can erase a person before they're even gone. Because sometimes, the saddest story isn't the one that ends in fire or betrayal, but the one that ends in silence. A coffin too small, a tomb with no statue, a name nearly lost. That was Edward VI, the king who was never really a king, the boy who was never really allowed to be a boy, the ghost that England forgot. And in that forgetting, we are reminded that even the quietest rain leaves a shadow, and some shadows never fade. She didn't ask for a throne. She didn't seek power, didn't raise armies. I didn't whisper in corridors or poison her rivals. She was 16 years old. She loved books more than mirrors. And her greatest sin, if history dared to name it one, was being born with a name that others could use. Lady Jane Grey. the girl who read Plato in the garden, who played the virginal with pale fingers and refused to flatter kings, was crowned Queen of England for exactly 9 days, not because she wanted it, but because a dying boy had signed away his soul to protect a kingdom that was already unraveling. Edward's death had opened a chasm, and into that silence poured ambition. The Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, Edward's most powerful advisor, and the man who had steered the country during the boy king's final decline. I knew that the Catholic Princess Mary Henry's firstborn could not be allowed to ascend. She was a threat not just to Protestant reform, but to everything he had built behind the throne. So he acted, and to cement that action, he married his son, Guildford Dudley, to Jane Grey, Edward's cousin. Devoutly Protestant, fiercely intelligent, and utterly unprepared. They didn't tell her at first. They waited until Edward had died. Then, in a hall, dim with candlelight, they came to her with words too heavy for her age. They called it duty. They called it destiny. She called it death. When they told her she was queen, Jane wept. Not with joy, not with awe, but with dread. She had studied the stories of kings and queens. She knew how they ended. Still, she was crowned. They brought her to the Tower of London not as a prisoner. Not yet. But as a monarch. They dressed her in royal gowns, placed a crown too large on her head, and declared her Queen Jane of England. For 9 days, she sat on a throne built on sand. No coronation was held. No armies were raised in her name. Outside the city, Mary Tudor was already gathering supporters. In Suffolk, they whispered her name in churches, declared her the rightful queen, and watched as loyalists flooded to her side. Back in the tower, Jane waited. She wrote letters. She read scripture. She prayed. And all the while, the walls around her began to whisper of betrayal, of collapse, of footsteps, marching not toward her coronation, but her end. When Mary entered London on the 10th day, the city erupted. Bells rang. People cheered. Banners were raised. Jane, still only 16, and still dressed in the robes of a queen she had never asked to be, was told quietly that it was over. Her reign, if it could be called that, had ended. She was no longer monarch. She was a traitor, and the tower that had once held her as queen now held her as prisoner. They took her crown. They took her name. But they could not take the weight of what had been done to her. Jane had not conspired. She had not fought. She had not even spoken against Mary. And for a time, it seemed she might be spared. Even Mary, the new queen, hesitated to kill her. She knew Jane was innocent. She knew the girl had been used. She called her a victim. But thrones demand blood, and rebellions do not wait for mercy. When Jane's father joined an uprising against Queen Mary, perhaps hoping to reverse the outcome, perhaps too foolish to see the truth, the tide turned. Jane was no longer just a symbol. She was a risk, a rallying point, a threat, and so, with the sorrow of a sister and the steel of a monarch, Mary signed her death warrant. Jane was told on the morning of February the 12th, she had one more day. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply asked for a minister, and for one final prayer. That night, she wrote a note in the margins of her Bible, a quiet message to the world she would leave behind. Live to die, that by death you may live forever. Words of calm, words of faith, words beyond her years. In the early light, they led her from her cell. She walked calmly through the courtyard of the tower. her small frame swallowed by the gray sky above. At the scaffold, she stood tall, a pale girl in black, carrying her own dignity like a crown no one could strip from her. She gave a short speech, forgave her executioner, and knelt. She was blindfolded, her hands searching for the block. For a moment, she faltered. Then, with quiet strength, she laid her head upon the wood. The axe fell once. She was 16. And thus ended the story of Lady Jane Grey, the girl who paid for Edward's crown, the girl whose reign was never real, but whose death was painfully so. They buried her in the tower beside her husband, Guildford, who had been executed just hours before. No grand tomb, no royal monument, just stone, earth, and silence. But history did not forget her. Centurie la terre. People would call her the 9 Days Queen. But that name does not capture the truth. Jane was never a queen in her own heart. She was a scholar, a girl of thought, not power. Her life was stolen by the ambitions of men. Her death required by the politics of fear. And in the shadow of Edward's empty vault, her name stands as another echo, another young life offered on the altar of Tudor survival. The crown had passed. The blood had been spilled. But the ghosts were only just beginning. They called her a monster before she had even lit the match. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, first child of Henry VIII. The girl who had been declared illegitimate, exiled, and stripped of every royal title, rose to the throne, not with ease, but through fire and fear. Her reign did not begin with coronation robes or music drifting through Westminster, but with the bloody remnants of her brother's will, the body of Lady Jane Grey cooling beneath the tower, and a kingdom already holding its breath. She was 37 years old when she became queen. Too old, they whispered, for new beginnings. Too Catholic, too scarred. But Mary had not waited her entire life to be quiet. She had watched her mother be banished, her title erased, her household destroyed. And still, she had knelt each day, prayed to the same saints, kissed the same crucifix, and waited. When her father died, she wept, not for him, but for what his crown had become, a hollow thing passed from child to child, built on broken marriages and broken promises. And now that it was hers, she would restore it, not just to glory, but to God. What followed was not restoration. It was reckoning. Mary's first act was to undo the Reformation. To her, it had not been reform, but betrayal, a severing of the soul of England from the true church. Her brother, Edward's Protestant laws were rolled back. Latin was restored to the Mass. Bishops who had once knelt for Edward now bent again, their oaths shifting with the wind. But Mary was not content with lip service. She wanted faith, not performance. So the heretics, those who refused, those who still clung to the English Bible, to secret sermons, to whispered rebellion, were brought to trial, and the fires were lit. It began slowly. A priest here, a preacher there, but soon the tempo quickened, the court growing bold as resistance flickered. The names began to pile up: Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer, and finally, Thomas Cranmer, the very man who had annulled her mother's marriage, who had crowned her father's other wives, who had penned Edward's Protestant reforms with his own trembling hand. He was dragged before the court, made to recant, then recanted his recantation, and when the flames consumed him, he held out his right hand to burn first, the hand that had signed his betrayal. London watched in stunned silence as the smoke rose from Oxford, from Smithfield, from towns where sermons ended in screams. Nearly 300 people would die by fire before the end. Men, women, the elderly, even pregnant mothers. And while Mary did not personally strike the match, her name was on every warrant. She called it justice. She called it cleansing. But the people began to call her something else. Bloody Mary. The name would haunt her. But the deeper truth was more painful still, for Mary was not cruel by nature. She was not bloodthirsty. She was desperate. Desperate to make sense of the throne she had waited so long to inherit. Desperate to wash away the sins of her father and brother. Desperate to save the soul of her country, even if it meant sacrificing its body. And perhaps most tragically, desperate to be loved. So she married. Her husband was Philip of Spain, a Habsburg prince, the heir to an empire that stretched from Madrid to the Americas, tall, cold, and deeply Catholic. He arrived in England with a face carved from marble and a heart already promised to duty. Mary adored him. Philip endured her. Their wedding was formal, joyless. Our heavily guarded the people booed him in the streets, fearing foreign rule, fearing Spanish ships in English harbors, fearing the Queen's womb. But Mary smiled through it all. She believed this union would save her not just politically, but physically. She needed an heir. And for a brief moment, it seemed her prayers had been answered. Her Stomach swelled. Her body changed. The court celebrated. Cradles were prepared. Songs composed. The future seemed certain. A son, a Catholic heir, a prince who would silence all doubt. But no child came. The swelling faded. The pain remained. It was not pregnancy. It was sickness. And when it happened again, the same symptoms, the same hopes, the same humiliating silence, the whispers began. That she had been cursed. That her womb was empty. That God had turned away. Philip returned to Spain. Mary remained. Alone. Ill. Hated. She looked out at a kingdom she had tried to save, and saw only fear in its eyes. The Protestants she had not burned fled to the continent. The Catholics she had hoped to unite bickered and plotted, and as her body began to fail, so did the strength of her rule. She died in the autumn of 1558. No child. No husband. No joy. The woman who had once walked into London as a savior was now lowered into the crypt of Westminster Abbey with no crowd. No glory. Only the weight of history pressing down like stone. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, took the crown within hours, and the fire the kind Mary had used to purify was extinguished. But her shadow remained, not because of what she did, but because of what she tried to undo. She had inherited a crown cracked by her father, propped up by her brother, and poisoned by fear. She had ruled for 5 short years, yet her name became myth, a warning, a curse, a story whispered to children and rebels alike. But perhaps the saddest truth of all is this: Mary Tudor did not burn England to punish it. She burned it trying to save its soul. And in doing so, she lost her own. She had watched them all fall. Her mother, beheaded before she could form a memory. Her father, a storm in human form. Too big to love. Too cruel to forget. Her brother, too frail to fight death. Her sister, too devout to rule the living. And when the crown came to her, it was not a gift, but a ghost, a fragile thing carved from blood, betrayal, and the soft bones of a dynasty already dying. Elizabeth Tudor, did not run from that crown. She met it with eyes wide open. She was 25 years old when they told her Mary was dead. When the torch of the Tudor name passed to hands no longer shaking, no longer praying for heirs, no longer pretending, she rode into London with her red gold hair loose, her face bare of jewels, her spine straighter than the cathedral spires. And the people, those same people who had knelt for Henry, wept for Edward, and burned under Mary, rose to meet her with hope they did not yet dare to believe in. But Elizabeth had learned every lesson, every silence, every scar from the tower, where she had once waited to die. She knew that a queen who weeps is forgotten, and a queen who wavers is buried. So she smiled, and behind that smile, she began to build something no Tudor before her had ever known, a reign not of terror or of faith, but of performance. She became the mask, and the mask became her. She declared herself married not to a man, but to her country, the Virgin Queen, a title both sacred and strategic. If she had wed, her power would have passed to a husband. If she had borne a child, her value would have ended in a cradle. But by remaining alone, she remained untouchable, an icon, a mystery, a symbol that no one could own, and no one could replace. And so she ruled, not by brute force, but by the slow, careful shaping of image and memory. She walked slowly through cathedrals, not just to pray, but to be seen. She wore white to remind them of purity, pearls to whisper chastity, and armor when words were not enough. When Parliament begged her to marry, she gave them riddles. When foreign kings sent her diamonds, she sent silence. When rebellion flared, she sent heads on pikes, but always with poetry to soften the blood. It worked. Her court became legend, not for its peace, but for its spectacle. She turned power into theater, her suitors into characters, her ladies into mirrors of her own myth. She read more than any man in her council. She spoke more languages than her ambassadors. She danced until dawn, and then rose at first light to read dispatches from Scotland, Rome, Spain, and the far corners of a world slowly expanding under English sails. But beneath the lace and the laughter, she was always alone. She had lovers, perhaps, but none who stayed. She had friends, but none who stood equal. She trusted no one fully, not even herself. For every letter she wrote, she burned 5. For every promise made, she buried another. She had seen what intimacy had done to her mother, what trust had done to her brother, what faith had done to Mary. And so she kept her heart like her crown hidden, unyielding, polished by fear. She ruled for decades, more than any Tudor. And under her, England did not burn, it bloomed. Poets thrived, theaters rose, exploration flourished. The Spanish Armada fell. She became more than queen. She became Gloriana, a living myth, a virgin goddess painted in gold, untouchable, eternal. But time does not care for myths. As the years dragged on, her face aged beneath the paint. Her teeth blackened. Her hair thinned. The gowns grew heavier. The procession slower. Her ladies whispered when they thought she could not hear. The courtiers who once knelt with admiration now watched with calculation. There were no children, no heirs, no future. Only the long shadow of silence. Still, she clung to the throne, because to surrender it would be to admit that she, too, was mortal, that the crown would outlive her, that the kingdom she had shaped with such ferocious beauty would pass to someone who did not remember the screams in the tower, the smell of fire in Mary's streets, the tremble in Edward's dying breath. So she kept going. Through winters where her joints ached too badly to dance, through summers when the sweat made her makeup melt and servants fled the stench, through nights when she woke in cold terror, unsure if she was still queen, or just another girl in the tower, waiting for morning to bring death. And then, slowly, her steps faltered. She stopped attending council. She stopped eating. She would not lie down, afraid she would never rise again. Her body, once weapon and symbol and stage, betrayed her. In March of 1603, surrounded by shadows and silence, she fell into a final sleep from which no crown could wake her. She was 69 years old. They buried her in Westminster Abbey, above her sister Mary. Their bones stacked like history itself, one queen who died for faith, another who died for image, and carved into the stone above them, partners in throne and grave, though enemies in life. But Elizabeth left more than bones. She left an idea that a woman could rule without kneeling, that a crown need not be passed through marriage or motherhood. That myth, if worn long enough, becomes truth. And in the centuries that followed, her face would adorn coins, un portrait, textbooks, not as the woman who grew old and afraid, but as the eternal queen, the last Tudor flame burning in a kingdom that had long stopped asking for fire. They called her the Virgin Queen. But perhaps, in the end, she was something else entirely, the queen who outlived her own heart. When the bells of Westminster tolled for Elizabeth Tudor in the spring of 1603, they did not ring for just a queen, or even for the end of a dynasty. They rang for the closing of an era, one carved from steel and scripture, from betrayals whispered in corridors and prayers drowned by the flames of heretics, from children crowned before they could bleed, and monarchs buried before they could love. The Tudors were over. The bloodline that had begun on a battlefield with Henry Tudor's sword and ended in a silent room with Elizabeth's thin breath had come full circle, and the kingdom it left behind did not mourn with tears. It mourned with caution. Because power does not deal, it is sealed. Elizabeth's body was embalmed with the same ritual silence that had governed her rule. She had chosen no husband, no child, no heir of her own body, but she had left behind the shape of a crown that would last sharp at the edges, seductive in its loneliness, heavy with memory. They lowered her into the vault beneath Westminster Abbey, not with weeping, but with reverence and relief. She would lie directly above her sister, Mary, as if in death they could be reconciled. Though no reconciliation had been offered in life, one had died for Rome, the other for England. One had loved too fiercely, the other not at all. And now their bones would share the same stone bed, separated by inches and eternity. They sealed the vault and left her there. Above her, the abbey moved on. Kings would be crowned and die. Empires would rise and collapse. Wars would shatter streets and rebuild them. But Elizabeth remained where they had left her, beneath flags that faded, beneath floors worn smooth by pilgrims and tourists, beneath the echo of choirs who no longer knew her name. And next to her, one by one, the others joined. Henry VII had long rested nearby, the founder of the line, buried beside his queen with a tomb heavy in Latin and Catholic pride. Jane Seymour, the only wife buried with honor, lay with a son who never grew old. Mary, Queen of Scots, once executed as a traitor, it would later be exhumed and moved into the same sacred stone to rest in honor irony so sharp it might have made Elizabeth weep. If queens were ever allowed that kind of pain, time turned bones into whispers. The coffins beneath the abbey were not built for eternity. Lead warps, wood cracks, seals break, and the bodies wrapped in silk and dreams, perfumed and painted, did not stay beautiful. They swelled, they leaked, they crumbled. Some exploded, others simply vanished into dust, so fine it could not be swept away without prayer. The vaults became tombs, then secrets, then myths. No one spoke of what lay beneath, not until centuries later, when curiosity, that small and dangerous fire, led historians to reopen what had long been shut. It was not for vanity, but for record, a need to confirm, to catalog, to verify. And so the stones were lifted, and the vaults unsealed, and the air that had not moved since the 17th century was breathed again. What they found was not glory. It was quiet. The bones were not arranged. The names had faded. Some bodies lay on top of others. Some coffins had collapsed entirely. In one vault, Elizabeth's bones rested still in the center, but her crown had long since decayed. The velvet had rotted. The lead had softened. What was once royal had become indistinguishable from the rest. The archaeologists and abbey keepers recorded what they could see, then resealed the stones. They did not disturb the bones of Anne Boleyn, for she was never brought here. Her remains lay elsewhere under marble without name, nor did they lift Edward again, the boy king, still curled in silence beneath his warped lid. They left them all where they were, because some stories, once sealed, I should stay that way. But they whispered, not through voices, but through absence, through the knowledge that beneath the most sacred place in the empire lay the scattered bones of a family that once defined the very shape of power, now forgotten by most who walk over them. Tourists take pictures. Ceremonies unfold. Coronations are planned above a foundation made not of stone, but of memory and rot. The Tudors, who once ruled with fire and scripture, with axes and ink, with letters written in blood and crowns balanced on executions, are now shadows in a vault. Their bodies, stripped of majesty, lie beneath feet that no longer kneel, beneath prayers that no longer name them. This, perhaps, is how history keeps its secrets, not by hiding them, but by letting them decay in plain sight, by letting time blur names into symbols, símbolos into hechos, echoes into dust. The bones remain, but the meaning fades, and what once burned the world to the ground is now sealed in a chamber no one dares to open twice, not because of what's inside, but because of what's no longer there. It vanished quietly. No thunder. No cry. No final proclamation carved in gold. When Elizabeth I died in the early spring of 1603, the Tudor crown, once soaked in battle, prophecy, and unrelenting fire, did not pass into the hands of another Tudor, because there were none left to take it. The dynasty had devoured itself. The sons were dead. The daughters were childless. The bloodline that had rewritten England's faith, restructured its power, and redefined monarchy itself, had ended in silence. And yet, the crown did not fall. It disappeared, passed like a whispered secret into the hands of James Stuart, a man born of Mary, Queen of Scots, the same Mary whom Elizabeth had imprisoned, condemned, and buried in the abbey, not far from her own bones. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as an heir to something he did not build and could not fully understand. The Tudor crown was not his. Not really. It sat differently. It weighed differently. It remembered things he did not. But England accepted him, because it had to. The people were tired of fire, tired of executions, tired of queens who bled the streets red to prove they ruled with righteousness. James brought promises of peace, of unity, of something new. But what he could never bring back was the strange, wild electricity of the Tudor age, the danger, the spectacle, the feeling that every step the monarch took might change the course of history, or end in blood. That era was gone, or so they thought, because memory does not die like bloodlines do. It lingers, it infects, it seeps into paintings, into poems, into the way history is told in hushed tones, by candlelight. The Tudors may have vanished from the family tree, but not from the imagination of the people. Their ghosts refused to go quietly. Henry VIII, larger than life, still haunted courtrooms and pulpits. His wives, their fates burned into the collective memory, became legends. Anne the seductress, Jane the mother, Catherine the martyr, Edward, the boy king, who died before he ruled, became the ghost of potential. Mary, the queen, who ruled through fire, became a cautionary tale. And Elizabeth, the woman who never married, never named an heir, and never let the crown slip, became an icon, not of monarchy, but of myth. Children learned their names before they learned geography. Plays were written, portrait restored, graves rediscovered. Each century returned to them, searching for meaning, as if the chaos they left behind still had something to say. Even the crown, the physical object, changed. The one Elizabeth wore no longer exists in its original form. Melted down, reset, repurposed. What remains is ceremony, not relic. The gold is the same, but it no longer knows her name. The jewels have been cleaned, the blood rinsed, the blade dulled. But you cannot erase weight, and when it rests on another head, it still carries the tremor of what came before. They try to forget. Every monarch after tried, in their own way, to bury the Tudors beneath progress. They built new palaces, changed the prayers, abandoned the superstitions, but somehow, always in times of uncertainty, in moments of crisis, the people returned to them, to Henry's rage, to Anne's eyes, to Elizabeth's silence, because what the Tudors did was not just rule, they made themselves unforgettable. They stitched themselves into the very fabric of English memory, not through mercy, not through peace, but through fire and fear and fascination. And memory, once corrupted by drama, does not easily fade. So when tourists walk through Hampton Court, they do not ask about James. They ask where Henry slept. They peer into dark halls and wonder if Anne Boleyn ever passed this way. When the bells of Westminster ring, few remember the Stuarts who followed, but they know that beneath those stones lie the bodies of queens who died for love, for power, or for nothing at all. Even now, Century la Terre, the Tudors sell books, fill screens, inspire obsession, because they gave history something rare, not just power, but performance, not just blood, but beauty, not just reigns, but stories. And stories, unlike crowns, do not disappear. They echo, they whisper through floorboards and old tapestries, through crumbling letters and cracked portraits, through nursery rhymes and coronation rituals. They shape the way we see monarchy, the way we define tragedy, the way we understand that behind every crown is a human head, soft, fragile, and destined to fall. So perhaps the crown did vanish. Perhaps it was buried under layers of time, melted into something more modern, more civilized, more polished. But the memory, it refused to die, because some legacies do not live in law or succession or thrones. Some live in the shadows cast by firelight, in the silence after a head is struck from its shoulders, in the breath that lingers after a queen whispers, "I am ready." The Tudors are gone, and yet they are everywhere. They did not last long, not by the measure of dynasties. Just over a century from Bosworth Field to the quiet room where Elizabeth closed her eyes forever. 5 monarchs, 2 queens regnant, 1 line forged in rebellion and broken by silence. The Tudors did not build an empire that reached across oceans. They did not inherit the world, they inherited chaos. And from it, they made something unforgettable. But it cost them everything. This house, this name, this crown, did not pass gently from parent to child. It cracked with every succession. It shed blood like ink. It burned heretics and queens, lovers and children. And in the end, it burned itself, not in flames seen from rooftops, but in the slow ruin of bodies too young, too old, too alone to carry what it meant to rule. There was never a moment of peace, not truly, not for Henry, who searched for sons and found only ghosts, not for Anne, whose eyes haunted corridors long after her head was taken, not for Edward, who reigned like a candle in the wind, not for Mary, who ruled with fire and died in shadow, not for Elizabeth, whose legend outlived her joy. And yet here we are, centuries later. We still whisper their names, still trace their stories in stone and gold and soft paper, still walk through the ruins of palaces and ask where they stood, where they wept, where they died, still wonder what it meant to hold that crown, to lose it, to be beneath it, because the Tudors did not disappear. They became legend. They became the flicker of torchlight on cold stone, the echo of a prayer beneath a vaulted ceiling, the creak of old wood in the tower. They became the warning at the heart of every monarchy that power, no matter how glorious, devours its own. And yet we love them. We love them for their cruelty and for their beauty, for their tragedy, for their defiance, for the way they held a nation's breath in their hands and squeezed until it sang. We do not look to them for peace. We look to them for meaning, for the stories that tell us how fragile we are, how dangerous love can be, how history is not a line, but a flame, flickering, bending, flaring, before it is snuffed out. This is your bedtime story. Then, not of princes and princesses who lived happily ever after, but of kings who bled, of queens who burned, of children crowned before they could speak, of vaults sealed with silence, of a house that gave us the myth of majesty and showed us its bones. So, close your eyes now, not in fear, but in reverence, for somewhere, under the floor of Westminster, under the dust of centuries, under the feet of tourists and the songs of choirs, they are still lying there, quiet, waiting, still wearing their stories like crowns. And if you listen carefully, not with your ears, but with the part of you that still believes in memory, you might hear them, not screaming, not weeping, just breathing. One final breath, held forever in stone.